Yeah, and at that point, uh, they talked about how quickly the money ran out. I mean, it's
One of the things we found was that while the Congress did come forward with a second tranche of funds, um, a lot of the business people, didn't know that. I mean, once you're denied by a bank, they didn't know, go back again and try again. And that's one of the many problems that's unfolded. But I hope that the listeners in the end will come away with, there are some lessons learned, and this is not sort of an unfixable problem.
um, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. If we're gonna wait maybe 2 more minutes so others can join us as well, and thank you again for spending your beautiful Tuesday morning with us in this morning scoop.
And Danielle, to your point, the Government Accountability Office actually has some interesting data, which I'm sure you and your colleagues have sort of sifted through as well. That first tranche of PPP largely went to these high dollar value loans aimed at large companies, whereas the second, third, and fourth tranches of PPP were much smaller in overall value, but largely went to smaller companies. So clearly there was the message was missing there in terms of encouraging smaller businesses to reapply if they got rejected the first time.
Good morning, everybody. Again, if you're just joining us, thank you. We're going to wait maybe 1 more minute so others can join us as well. And then we'll start the morning scoop at exactly 8:01 in the morning. All right, I think we are going to start. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Arizona Capital Times morning scoop on government fraud and waste. This morning, we're going to focus on the Paycheck Protection Program, which was designed to help small businesses retain employees as they struggle to float amidst the worst pandemic in a century. A watchdog group found that millions of dollars actually didn't go to intended recipients, and that the federal government could have rolled out this and other COVID-19 spending programs with more oversight and protections against fraud and abuse. My name is Luigi Del Puerto. I'm the associate publisher and editor of the Arizona Capital Times. If you don't have an Arizona Capital Times subscription, let me know. I'll get that squared away. We have a great panel this morning, but first I want to thank our sponsor. The Project on Government Oversight is a nonpartisan independent watchdog that investigates and exposes waste, corruption, abuse of power in government. The group champions reforms to achieve an effective, ethical, and accountable federal government that safeguards constitutional principles. The group started in 1981 as a small Pentagon watchdog, an offshoot of the National Taxpayers Union, and funded by a mix of conservative and progressive organizations. With the help of Pentagon insiders and government documents, it brought to light, for example, wasteful spending such as 7,600 coffee pots and 435 hammers. In 2006, the group launched the Congressional Oversight Initiative, realizing that Congress needed help to become more effective at conducting oversight of the executive branch and to exercise its role in a democracy system of checks and balances. POGO's investigators are experts in working with whistleblowers and other sources inside the government. So again, I want to thank the Project on Government Oversight for sponsoring today's morning scoop. We have a great panel this morning. Joining us is State Representative Tim Dunn, who represents Legislative District 13. Representative Dunn was first appointed to the Arizona House of Representatives in 2018 to represent constituents from Yuma, Buckeye, El Mirage, Glendale, Goodyear, Litchfield Park, Surprise, Welton, and Wickenburg. He's a lifelong resident of Yuma, and he operates a family-run business, Dunn Grain Company Incorporated, which specializes in selling grains and exporting crops like garbanzo beans, black-eyed peas, Sudan grass, and wheat. He was named the 2017 Arizona Farm Bureau Farmer of the Year. He has been active, or rather an active voice on county issues related to agriculture. In 1999, the Yuma County Chamber of Commerce awarded him Agricultural Person of the Year. Representative Dunn was also appointed by the governor to the Arizona Department of Agriculture Advisory Board from 2006 to 2011, and he served as chairman in 2009. In addition to his service on this board, he served on various state and national committees from 1999 to 2015. Representative Dunn is a graduate of the University of Arizona, and he obtained a bachelor's degree in agronomy. Representative Dunn, thank you again for joining us this morning.
Thanks for being, glad to be here.
Also joining us is Danielle Bryan, who is the Executive Director of the Project on Government Oversight. Under her leadership, the organization has grown from 2 employees and a budget in thousands of dollars in 1993 to an organization with over 40 staff and a budget of $6 million. Ms. Bryan has testified before Congress over 40 times, and under her leadership, the work of the Project on Government Oversight has resulted in the passage of the Whistleblower Protection Enhancement Act, the Freedom of Information Reform Act, and the Inspectors General Enhancement Act, and those all happened in the past decade alone. The group has exposed and removed conflicts of interest at the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Department of Interior, and the FDA. The Project on Government Oversight has also trained more than 2,100 congressional staffers on how to effectively use their oversight powers. Ms. Bryan has been recognized by the National Journal as one of the top 50 people changing the game in Washington. She's a member of the Freedom of Information Act Hall of Fame, and she received the Smith College Medal. Danielle received her Bachelor's of Arts in Government from Smith College and her master's degree in International Relations from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Danielle, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you so much for having me, Luigi.
And finally, also joining us is Andrew Lautz, who is the Policy and Government Affairs Manager for the National Taxpayers Union, an organization that seeks to achieve policy outcomes that are pro-taxpayers. In his role, Andrew works with stakeholders on and off Capitol Hill to promote pro-taxpayer health, tax, and regulatory policy. He also helps lead NTU's work on Pentagon spending, government transparency, and congressional reform. Before joining NTU, Andrew conducted research for a number of political and issue advocacy campaigns. He is a graduate of George Washington University in Washington, D.C., with a bachelor's degree in political communications and a master's degree in political management. He enjoys running D.C.'s concert scene when everybody had concert scenes, and of course, cheering on his adopted hometown baseball team, the Washington Nationals. Andrew, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Luigi.
So as I mentioned, we are going to talk about government fraud and waste, more specifically, the Paycheck Protection Program. Of course, the Paycheck Protection Program, which provides small businesses with funding to pay for up to 8 weeks of payroll costs, including benefits, had authorized up to $659 billion for job retention and certain other expenses. And I want to go to Danielle first. Tell us, what are you seeing in terms of how this program was rolled out? I guess more specifically, what kinds of abuses or fraudulent activities had arisen out of its implementation?
It's really an unfortunate and it was a predictable mistake when what we saw with the program, frankly, the legislation was very good and it made a lot of sense, and there was clearly an emergency and we needed, our economy needed help, and small businesses in particular needed help. And in fact, the Senate was very clear in saying we need to prioritize minority and women-owned businesses and veteran-owned businesses getting these funds first. That's not what happened. So the failure was really in the implementation right off the bat, where the SBA, the Small Business Association or Administration, which was the agency where all the lending organizations were getting the funds, just went straight too quickly to the big banks And the big banks essentially went to their biggest clients first. And so you hear many stories of small business owners desperately trying to get a call back from their community, their bank, and they were just not getting access to any even information. And what we saw, and our investigators at Pogo found, that there were even private equity firms that were Chinese owned that were getting access to the initial tranche of funds, while small businesses were suffering and closing down. So that was a mistake that didn't need to happen. If the legislation had been implemented properly and they had at least made sure that those who needed it most got it first.
I want to go to Andrew real quick. The idea was that we needed to roll this program out as quickly as we could. There were, obviously many businesses had either been shut down or had ceased operations, or just decided on their own, okay, we can't risk the safety of our staffers and our customers. Was the mistake to your mind that we quickly rolled it out? The need then was to quickly roll it out, or if you can give us kind of an overview of what the mistake had been and what allowed abuse and fraudulent activities to occur within this program.
So obviously the trade-off between speed and full oversight and accountability mechanisms in the Paycheck Protection Program. We talk about it a little bit as a trade-off, but I think that doesn't give Congress enough credit. I think Congress can walk and chew gum at the same time. Clearly, passing and implementing the Paycheck Protection Program with speed was necessary, given the state our country was in and our economy was in back in March, but that didn't mean that Congress had to cut corners. And to Danielle's point, I think that they could have implemented things a lot better. You saw as just an example, when Treasury issued some further guidance on what they would deem economic necessity in the program in terms of whether businesses actually need these funds. You saw about 15% of loans worth more than $2 million get returned before the safe harbor date that the Treasury Department had set up for the return of PPP loans. So that suggested to me that clear and consistent standards were necessary because you had so many businesses returning those loans after more clear standards were issued. And so if Congress had taken, even if it's just another day or two or another week, obviously timing was of the essence, but it's an extraordinarily powerful institution with a lot of capacity and brain power. We think that there needs to be more capacity and even more capacity and brain power in Congress. But if they had, I think, worked a little bit more deliberately at the start of the process, then we could have had more clear and consistent standards and avoided some of the issues with PPP and its implementation.
Representative Dunn, I want to ask you about your experience. You're a businessman. Of other business people who had either applied for the loan, got in the loan, or denied the loan early on, or maybe the money ran out too quickly. But tell us about your experience here.
Thank you. When the loans first came out, one of the big problems, and I agree with my panelists, is that they did it quickly. We needed to get quickly. But the first experience was that, and I don't blame the lenders. The lenders, they're looking at the bigger loans, and so they probably started processing their biggest customers first, their priority customers, and so they would process, because they have a timing issue, so they would process those first, process $1 or $2 million loans as opposed to $50,000 loans. So that's just the nature of management of your time, but that was not what the intention of the PPP loan was, and so that's where we needed that oversight and that to kind of direct our loan lenders to what to do specifically. But so we have a lot of companies. The small banks were able to, it seemed like in Arizona, specifically here in Yuma, the smaller banks were able to get a lot of small loans out. We had 2 different applications with the small bank that got those applications done. That we had it with the larger bank system for the other 2 businesses, and those were missed out on the first round. And so those were the ones that had the most employees that needed the PPP loan the most for us to keep them on our staff. So, and we were only one business like many that were just skipped out on that first round because of the big banks. It funneled that money to the majority of the bigger clients.
Luigi, if I could add,
yeah.
there's an ongoing problem that really could be fixed. The Congress, when they passed the CARES Act, made it very clear that there were certain requirements for transparency in these loans that that the Treasury Department specifically and the Office of Management and Budget have essentially ignored. The one that I think is most important is collecting information from the recipients. Now, that is not something that is at the front end slowing down the process. It is what they should be doing quarterly once the recipients have received the money, so that the government can be sure, and the public and journalists can be sure, and the community can be sure that the money was going to keep people on the payroll. But unfortunately, in the implementation, they are not collecting any money from recipients. So we don't know whether these funds are going to keep people on the payroll or not. And that, from us, is it is emboldening fraudsters, which we are, regularly seeing stories across the country, people buying Lamborghinis with these funds, because they're aware that there's actually no oversight that's happening at the basic level that the Congress had required. They're just actually not fulfilling this requirement. And it's something that should and can and should be fixed.
I want to make sure I'm understanding that. So what you're saying is that the Small Business Administration or just the federal government in general, after disbursing the funds, I understand the immediacy and the urgency of disbursing the funds. So what you're saying is that after they've been disbursed, the federal government then should have collected as much data as they could, or required those businesses that receive the loan to submit data, so that we can track who they are and what they're doing with the money. And that,
yes,
you're saying that's not happened.
Why first of all, it is required by the law that it happen, but it's not. And that is also how the government has historically functioned. When the government presents grants or loans, the recipients are supposed to return data about what they're doing with it. But the administration's Office of Management and Budget sent a directive out to all the agencies saying, don't collect any additional information. And so they're literally not collecting any information from the recipients. So it is called the Paycheck Protection Program, but we don't know whether it's protecting paychecks or not.
And when this was originally established, we had, you put your application in, you had 2.5 times your monthly payroll, and then you had to spend that, you use for 8 weeks for your payroll. They've since extended that to 24 weeks. And so what you had is you had businesses closing, and you were supposed to keep them on your payroll even if you weren't working. So you keep people on your payroll, and then even if you're a restaurant or some businesses were able to stay working, but so you're keeping those on your payroll, working them. But when you did lay people off, then you get your loan, you try to bring them people back. Now you're competing with the government because they added they hire the extra $600 on the unemployment. So even if you're trying to hire your people back, you're competing with the government. They're like, I can get more money just staying at home. And so you had businesses who were trying to cooperate that couldn't, because one, they were limited to 25% of their restaurant or whatever their businesses were. People are shut down, and then their employees are not wanting to come back. So some businesses were kind of stuck with, that's why they extended it to 24 weeks, so that you can actually verify that process. But it was during the summertime it's tough to comply, but you're right, the government still needs to come back and ask you what you are doing with the money.
And I think here there's layer upon layer of falling short of what the law requires. As you sort of alluded to, Danielle, it's the Government Accountability Office, which is a nonpartisan watchdog, and one that I'll probably cite a lot throughout our chat, because they've been doing good research and good oversight of PPP as they can. GAO reported, I think it was a month or two ago, that roughly 1 in 5 of the loans, the PPP loans that they had examined from the Small Business Administration's data, lacked any job retention data or showed that 0 jobs were retained under PPP. Now, it's tempting to say this is, someone, you point to a particular actor and say it's their fault. I think, as I mentioned at the beginning here, this is sort of layer upon layer of failure, where in some cases you probably probably have businesses that are falling short of reporting the necessary job retention data. Of course, like Danielle, we're concerned at NTU about fraud in the program. But you also have potentially financial institutions not strictly enforcing standards, and or you have the Treasury Department and the SBA not setting consistent standards, clear and consistent standards for how PPP recipients are supposed to report job retention data. So, there's layer upon layer of failure, but it starts with the top. And that's why Congress, and more specifically the Treasury Department and Small Business Administration on the federal agency side of things, really need to team up, and they should have had these standards long ago. They certainly need them now.
So, I want to pause here for a second and ask our viewers and our listeners, if you have questions for our panelists, do send them in via the Q&A room, via the chat room. We want your questions, and we will do our best to get to as many of them as possible toward the end of the program. Danielle, do you have any specific state-by-state data that, let me back up a bit. So one of the things that you mentioned is the fact that these loans are supposed to help businesses retain employees. And for one reason or another, that's not exactly what happened. And I'm wondering if you have...
To be fair, we don't know. I mean, I can't assert that people aren't keeping their employees on the payroll. It's just that the government's not collecting the data for us to know. So when you see, and you'll on occasion see analyses, as Andrew was pointing to, that talks about a certain number of employees or zero, those are only the numbers that were on the application for the loan. On how many intended to, and the zero also raises questions like, why did they get it if it had 0 employees? But that's a separate question. But we don't actually have the real data yet. But what we do have, and if you wouldn't mind, I'd love to share my screen.
Go ahead.
So Pogo let me see if I'll talk while I'm trying to manage this technical. Pogo has created, based on the data so far, an analysis that this is actually our demo sheet. Can you see my screen?
Mm-hmm.
Are you able to?
Yes.
So this is, as you can see, I've been able to go into the search for Maricopa County, which is where many of your listeners are, and you can see by zip code. And using a color code, the amounts, you can go down to which are only the really big loans, and you can see where where they are. And you also can look by unemployment rate, which I think is really very helpful for us looking at, was the money going to the people who needed it most, as well as minority population. And the unemployment rate, we look both at April and July. We'll be updating these. You also can go to industry overviews by state, and for example, for agriculture, and get a better picture by state on how much was going into Arizona, for example, for agriculture. So I think for policymakers, this may hopefully be very useful to get a better picture of who was benefiting and also who was left behind. This is our demo, so you're getting a sneak peek. But it's going to be going live later this week. The URL is covidtracker.pogo.org. And so again, it's covidtracker.pogo.org. You'll be able to search by a recipient. And part of why I think that is important is I think it's important for us to know if there are people who you'll find here who received the loans, but who furloughed all their employees and didn't bring them back. That doesn't mean, as Representative Dunn was pointing out, that there's fraud, but it raises some questions. It starts to ask, well, who benefited and who did not benefit, which is really important for us to be learning, because I do hope that the Congress is going to be coming back with another package, because our economy is still in grave trouble. There's still, tremendous unemployment, but we need to be learning from mistakes that were made. Rather than continuing just to pour money out without the kinds of information that we need to make sure it's going to the best places.
So I want to go to Andrew. Andrew, of course, there's I think one of the conflicts is that you, to a certain extent, you want to protect the privacy of the businesses that have received the loan and used the loan, and especially the small ones, right? The mom and pop shops, the small businesses. And at the same time, the need for transparency. The American taxpayers kind of have they need to know how their money is being spent. How do you actually balance those?
It is a tough balance, and I can actually tell you, based on talking with Republican offices on Capitol Hill, that I think this is one of their main concerns. I think most elected members of Congress, Republicans or Democrats, are supportive of some level of transparency for PPP loan data, because it's more than $600 billion of taxpayer dollars that's been put on the line here. But we want to protect proprietary business information, particularly for small mom and pop stores, Luigi, as you mentioned. So I would say, and this is I think just where NTU comes from, that ensuring that data on a business's revenue isn't shared with the public. I mean, that makes sense, especially when when everyone can access PPP data. You wouldn't want, say, a competitor of a business in your area to be able to access that information. But a minimum amount of basic data, I think, for all loans, whether they're small loans or large loans, are required here, and that would include the loan recipient, of course, the date they received the loan, the jobs that the number of employees they had at the time of receiving the loan, and the number of jobs that they retained after a certain time period. And again, Congress can sort of set that in statute, say we want to look at this in 6 months or in a year or in 2 years or all of the above. I think, but it's been a challenge, and it's taken government watchdogs and members of Congress and non-government watchdogs like POGO and like NTU to sort of push the Treasury Department to even release loan data for the big loans worth $150,000 or more. Treasury is still pushing back on releasing loan data for loans $150,000 or less. But I believe a federal court just ruled that data will eventually have to be disclosed, and that's a win for transparency. But of course, it's a balance. So the idea here is not to shame any individual business for accepting federal assistance when they did so properly and when it was so sorely needed at the height of the pandemic's economic impact. But the idea is to make sure that this enormous taxpayer investment is protected with some level of oversight and accountability.
Representative Dunn, I'm sorry, Daniel, you were going to jump in real quick. Go ahead, ma'am.
I was going to jump in. I agree with everything Andrew is saying. And I think it's important first also to note that this kind of transparency about government grants has been historically what is normally done. Since 1990, any of these grants coming out of the SBA, the recipients without this 150,000 cutoff, below 150,000, that information is public. And in fact, as Representative Dunn might remember, when a person applied for the PPP loan, it actually says this information will be released through the Freedom of Information Act. So this idea now suddenly that we're worrying about privacy when, that this is a new concept that hasn't existed for many decades in federal funds. So I think that was sort of a weird false start that happily the courts are overruling. But there was a question in the chat that I also wanted to respond to about what Congress should do. And to be fair to the Congress, they didn't really make the mistakes. It's really in the implementation of the legislation where the mistakes are happening. And I was able to testify before the Senate, I believe it was in July, the Senate Homeland and Government Affairs Committee. And it was specifically around what to do to fix these problems. And the big thing, and this is something we work with NTU on a lot, is getting the Congress to recognize that they need to use their power of the purse. They're the ones who can say, if if you, government agency, are not doing what we said you should do, we have the power of the purse. We can start, withhold funds for travel for the, Secretary of Treasury until you do what we say. And that's the kind of thing we may have to get to when this was a bipartisan piece of legislation, and it was the Senate, the Republican Senate, that made clear that these are the standards that need to be held, and they're being ignored.
Representative Dunn, I want to go to you, sir. You're on the ground. You're a business person. You're seeing what's happening. You mentioned earlier on that some small businesses were not necessarily able to access the loan at the very start of the program. It's in, the first time it was rolled out, but then in the subsequent rollouts, they had been able to get the loan and provided their businesses with would help in some and relief. Tell us about, maybe not just in your case, but in the cases that you know of farmers, for example, that have gotten the loan. How are they doing right now? And maybe not just maybe not just the farmers, but other businesses in your district. How are they? What are they telling you?
Well, they're really struggling still, trying to keep our county open. Pretty much you can do everything except go out to big events. So people can go to restaurants and go to things, but we're really staying home. And so our public, and especially now with the number spiking, so, businesses being open, even if they're limited to 50%, they're not getting the clientele. The public is still scared to go out and really actually to frequent the restaurants. The gyms seem like they're really opening up and doing well. And that's a big mental relief. Our gym owners were really struggling. We had several here in Yuma that were just brand new gyms that had opened up and literally the month before COVID. So I think that is good. But there's several businesses that I know that, one opened up a brand new Lapel's dry cleaning unit in Yuma the month before this opened. She was able to qualify for the second round of PPP, but then it's just everybody's not going out. People aren't getting their dry cleaning. They're just doing Zoom meetings, and so that small business, she wasn't out. She had to end up closing her doors a month ago just because if she had another relief package come through, she thought she could be able to hang on till the springtime, but nothing came through, and she was out of cash, and so she had to close up her business in here in Yuma. So there's several businesses like that, and I think everything is just the whole economy. You mentioned agriculture and farmers. We're still growing crops, but the conventions and the restaurants and that kind of stuff, the hotels, that's a big part of our agricultural produce industry. And so when you don't have that food service industry out there, it really takes a big chunk of the production. And so we're having the same problems as other people are. But the relief, there was different relief packages to helping on some of those things on the COVID side of things for agriculture. But I think back to your point, Danielle, about the SBA loans and stuff. If you're an SBA customer, you knew that you're already signing on. That was public. We have a lot of new people that have never done that before. They signed on. They get a little bit of buyer's remorse because they didn't really want their information out there, but that's what they signed on the paperwork. And that's not really trade secrets. How many employees you have at your restaurant or your place is not that big a deal. It's just people didn't realize that their name was going to be on a list. But that's part of the process when you take government dollars.
Yeah.
So Danielle, you mentioned earlier on that there are things that you can do, the things that Congress can do at this point to force the federal agencies to comply with the law that they passed. Right? The requirements, for example, for transparency and submission of data. Do you foresee this next this next year that Congress would actually act and compel the Treasury Department, for example, to really be more aggressive in getting those data?
Well, we have two things we have to worry about. One is that they need to fix the problems and sort of enforce the law, essentially. But the other thing that's being floated that we think is really problematic, that Secretary Mnuchin, Secretary of Treasury, has been talking about wholesale forgiveness of loans without any of this data having been collected. And so remember, these are loans that can become grants so that they won't be, owed back, which we think makes great sense, because what's the point of the loan if you're just keeping the businesses afloat, as long as that that's how they use them. Our real worry, and that was getting some currency in both the House and the Senate, was the idea that, frankly, in order to it was largely because of lobbying by the lending industry, because they're the ones who would have to do the work to start doing the due diligence to collect the data. Because of course, as Representative Dunn says, an employer knows whether they have all the tax information on whether they have employees or not. You're not asking additional work to pull together that information. It's just collecting the information is the right now sort of in jeopardy, and we're really alarmed and very opposed to the idea of wholesale forgiveness, because we think that's really inviting wholesale fraud.
When you say wholesale forgiveness, can you what does that mean exactly? So right now, if you do certain if you met certain requirements, the loan that you have as you mentioned, become grants, so you don't have to pay those back. But when you say wholesale forgiveness, flesh that out. What does it exactly mean for, let's say, a small business owner when that becomes available?
Well, essentially what will happen is the small business owner will not have to pay back the loan. So that's great. But the problem is that the lender hasn't collected information from that recipient to determine whether that recipient had kept people on the payroll or had met those requirements. So essentially, by wholesale forgiveness, what Secretary Mnuchin is saying is to completely abandon that element of oversight, just to demonstrate, just for the recipients to demonstrate that they used the funds in the way that they were intended to be used.
And is this something that can be done via executive action, or is this something that Congress would have to actually legislate?
This is pending legislation that's being floated around.
And by the way, is supported by one of Arizona's senators, Senator Sinema, and the big concern I have here is this bill, or at least the Senate bill, I'm not sure if the House bill has the same threshold, is automatic forgiveness for loans of $150,000 or less. If that figure sounds familiar, it's the threshold for which we have no loan data right now from SBA on who has benefited from that program. And that's not to suggest, I'm not suggesting some conspiracy here or some, it's certainly not to suggest, I would expect that the overwhelming majority of those businesses went through the proper procedures and are using those PPP funds in the proper ways. But the idea that we would, sort of have automatic forgiveness without knowing, who is receiving that automatic forgiveness, I think that is concerning. And again, the bottom line here is not to, I don't think for Pogo or for NTU or for anyone on this panel, it's not to shame businesses for accepting help when they needed it. It's to ensure that this massive taxpayer investment is protected with the right amount of oversight and accountability.
And I'd like to add to that the amount of money that went to the lower than $150,000 threshold is 90% of the total COVID relief spending, and it's 85% of the grants. And part of what our worry is, when you use our data on our covidtracker.pogo.org and you just go by zip code, you suddenly will see many loans or grants going to the same person or same organization or entity. So the question then becomes, it may be multiple $150,000 loans going to the same entity, but none of these things are currently being elevated. So we can't tell whether that's what's going on or not, which is why we need the data before there is any forgiveness.
Andrew, you mentioned two things, right? I'm sorry, Representative Dunn, were you gonna jump into, did you have something in mind? Yeah.
Right now, the process is, depending on the timing of when you got your loan, you're in the process of applying for that forgiveness. If you're choosing to apply for forgiveness, not every, some people might have they had their employee, they might have chose to buy some equipment or something, or they're, not necessarily have to be fraud, but what happens, like you were talking about, Andrew, is if, we're putting this application in for forgiveness right now through the bank, and it shows that we have to prove our payroll. That's what the small companies are doing, putting the payroll records into the bank. It's a pretty simple process. They've actually streamlined it. So, but if we're asking for new funds to be coming out with the next Congress, if we just give blanket forgiveness, then you're going to really ramp up the fraud, because we needed people in the way. I didn't have to prove myself last time. So that's what they're going to do. So you need to require everybody to follow the rules, which is simple to do. It is, the lenders, I'm sure, are not wanting to do it because it does require them to work, and they're getting a small margin on these loans, but the process is simple. The small businesses are starting to do that now as they went through the program. And I think if we're going to ask for more money to come out, we need to make sure we hold everybody accountable at this point.
Thank you, Representative Dunn. Andrew, you mentioned two things, right? So on the one hand, the federal government is not collecting the data that needs to be collected, as Congress said, required in this program. And the second thing is that you mentioned when the federal government does have the data, right, they're not necessarily providing it to the public. Can you tell us a little bit more about what's going on there?
Well, and Danielle, I think you and Pogo have been tracking this even more closely than NTU is. So if anything I say is wrong, please feel free to jump in and correct me. I think it took sort of it felt like a Herculean effort at the time for, again, members of Congress, government watchdogs like the Government Accountability Office, and non-government watchdogs like Pogo and NTU to sort of push Treasury and the Small Business Administration to disclose data on really any PPP loans, because I believe that their position, Treasury's position earlier on in this program was that we don't have to disclose any of this data, even though I certainly read the statute differently. So eventually they disclosed loan data for loans valued at $150,000 or more. And to Treasury's credit, currently that data is easy to pull and extract. If you do a Google search for PPP data, likely the first result you're going to come up with is a Department of Treasury website that links to a whole bunch of zip files. You can either download the whole zip file, and your Microsoft Excel will probably take 10 minutes to process it because there are millions and millions of line items in there. Or you can download by state. You could download Arizona's data and see, which businesses in the state have received loan data of $150,000 or more, along with job retention data. Although, as we discussed earlier, sometimes the data itself is an issue where 1 in 5 loans don't have adequate job retention data or report 0 jobs being retained as a result of a PPP loan. So there are data quality issues, but actually extracting that data for loans $150,000 or more is pretty easy at this point. Now, Treasury and SBA should continue to update that, especially if we have an additional tranche of PPP, or if the existing money that's left in the PPP program is sort of reactivated by Congress, reauthorized by Congress. But we're still fighting to get access to data on loans of $150,000 or less. And I believe the last I checked was that a federal judge ordered the Treasury Department to disclose that data by a certain date in November. But more recently, that judge sort of reversed themselves and said, well, actually, you have a little bit more time to comply to this with this order. So I believe that data is coming. We have a little bit of uncertainty right now exactly when that data will come.
So right now the COVID-19 cases are spiking, all across the country. There are some states that have implemented very strident measures to try their best to curb the spread of this virus. Representative Dunn, I want to go to you and ask you what you're hearing from the governor's office in terms of how we're managing this new surge of COVID-19 cases.
Well, you've seen the governor's press releases and stuff. We're still trying to keep businesses open. We're still trying to keep the schools open. We really, that's our main focus, is keeping the schools. They're doing a Herculean effort to try to keep the teachers safe. But just really focus on the schools, because this kids, the cure is worse than the disease for kids' mental health, as far as kids, when you're talking kids. So we got to keep the kids in school. The governor's really focusing on that. But we have to be safe. We got to limit our groups. We've got to limit the big events, and people are getting sick when they go to their home parties on the weekend. They're doing those functions and they're coming back to work. They're not getting sick at work. We've got, just you talk to different employees and different employers, they get sick on the weekends. They're not getting sick at work. And so we just, we need to focus on that. We're taking it very seriously, but we've just really got to focus on keeping the schools open, because that's how we keep our small businesses, people able to go to work. And I just got to applaud the teachers and all the superintendents for all the work that they're doing on that. And it's there's some schools that are not all the way open yet, that they're staying in virtual, but they are working at it. Had a couple schools open and then they closed down because they had 5 or 6 kids get positive. So it's an effort we're working on. But I think, as we talked about earlier on offline, is that now that the weather's nice and things are, we have a beautiful outdoor weather, we can do a lot more things outside as opposed to in the summertime where we're doing things in the air conditioner. So I think we kind of level off on this spike, and hopefully we can just get through the holidays and keep our hospital rates down. We got to focus on the hospitals.
And I asked the question because, as we see cases, COVID-19 cases spiking, there will be pressure, for example, for state governments and local governments to try and reimpose the more strident measures that local governments and state governments had imposed early on during the pandemic, which was to, compel certain businesses to cease operations, for example. I know in the state of Arizona, that's not exactly what our governor is thinking of doing, but what we have is a situation in which people are, businesses might need to limit their operations, maybe even cease their operations. So there's going to be a big need again for some help, some relief from the federal government. And I want to ask actually Danielle and Andrew, but before then, Representative Dunn, I'm wondering if you're seeing, if you're getting feedback from not just your colleagues, but from your constituents, from other business organizations for the need for a new round of, let's say, paycheck protection program.
Yes, there's several businesses that are struggling because they're not able to, like the one I cited that had to close, just because the volume of business is just not able to, they're trying to keep their employees working. They're just not having the volume of business. And so there is a need for that, as it goes forward, especially if you start limiting the restaurants and the bars. And I think there's some specific things we know that when you have an atmosphere where you're having a good time and you're dancing and you're having at a bar, there's very limited way to have social distancing in that. And so I would be a proponent of making sure that we give some specific things for those kind of businesses that just really can't open, that we need to help their livelihood. We're going to need to help them get through this because we need to help, our folks. We have our young folks that are millennials that are wanting to go out to socialize, and that's where it spikes. And so there's some things that we need to do to help those areas that need to be shut down for the better public good. But it should be not at their cost of their business to going out of business. It should be at a bigger public good. So yeah, I think we need to be looking at that going forward.
So now my question then becomes, Danielle and Andrew, what are you hearing from Congress in terms of maybe a new round of COVID-19 relief? And I guess more specifically, how does Congress this time actually make sure that we have transparency, we have oversight, that we're doing everything we can do to ensure that we minimize fraud and waste? And Danielle, I know you mentioned this is not, Congress actually, to your mind, did their part in crafting the law, but moving forward, what can Congress do?
Well, that was really the purpose of the Senate hearing this summer, was to sort of learn from some of the mistakes. And for example, Andrew was alluding to a Treasury Department interpretation of the law that says, well, actually, these transparency requirements don't apply to all the funds that are coming through Treasury. That was a contorted view of the law by Treasury, but that's an example where the Congress can say, no, we actually meant everything that comes from Treasury needs to be transparent. So there's some clarifications where I don't think the Congress got it wrong, but they can make it clearer. I also think, as we discussed, it is really important that while they do move forward, I mean, I saw last night the video of the and what seemed to be endless lines at a food pantry in Texas. I mean, there's real needs for the economy and for helping people. So there's no doubt that I'm hoping that Congress, now that the election is over, can turn back to this, but they need to make sure not to endorse as part of the package this wholesale forgiveness that as Andrew mentioned, is something that Senator Sinema has been sponsoring in the Senate.
Andrew, the same question to you.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything Danielle said. I think as Congress is considering this, this whole issue with the CARES Act over Treasury interpreting that Division A, which was all of sort of the supplemental appropriations to federal agencies, was under sort of the oversight purview, but all of these new programs like the Paycheck Protection Program and the Employee Retention Tax Credit were not under sort of their oversight umbrella. Ran contrary to congressional intent. Congress, I think, in its debate over the CARES Act, in member statements about the CARES Act, was pretty clear that they intended for all of this to have robust oversight mechanisms. But there's a scene, a joke in the show I like, and probably some of your viewers like, The Office, where at one point Michael Scott, the main character of the show, says, "Explain this to me like I'm a 5-year-old." And sometimes Congress needs to explain to the federal agencies like they're 5, because they do know better. But I think, where Congress's interpretation of a particular statute can be questioned or thrown in doubt by a federal agency, sometimes it is. And so if Congress can be clearer in the next package, saying, every division of this package is subject to transparency and oversight from all of the various mechanisms that Congress has set up, its sort of own select committee on the coronavirus crisis, the various governmental nonpartisan watchdogs that Congress has set up to accompany the CARES Act, whatever future package should come with requirements that every single division, every provision, every section, every program in this bill is subject to oversight from these watchdogs.
Andrew, you mentioned the Employee Retention Credit Program. What can you explain to us? What is that exactly? How is it different from the PPP, and what might be its advantages? For example, if we burst funds, through this program rather than, let's say, for example, the Payment Protection Program.
Sure, and I speak for NTU here, not necessarily for my fellow panelists, but at NTU, we're big fans of the Employee Retention Tax Credit. This was another program that was included in the CARES Act. It's sort of often paired with PPP in terms of its ability to help small businesses retain their employees through this crisis. It's a payroll tax credit that's worth up to 50% of $10,000 in wages per employee. So that means a payroll tax credit equal to $5,000 per employee, so long as you keep employees on the payroll and your business meets one of two conditions. The condition being you're either partially or fully shut down as a result of state or local orders, or you've experienced a certain amount, a drop in revenue as a result of sort of the economic crisis that we're experiencing. So there are bipartisan proposals in Congress that would expand the size of the credit. One of the major bipartisan proposals would significantly increase the size of the credit from $5,000 per employee to up to $36,000 per employee. Would also allow, say, provision of health coverage by businesses to be counted as an eligible expense under the Employee Retention Tax Credit, which we think would help employers retain health insurance for their employees. We obviously don't want people losing access to their employer-provided health insurance during this crisis, particularly during a public health crisis. So, we're at NTU, we're big fans of the ERTC and expanding it as a way to help small businesses. And to answer your question on the advantages over PPP, well, you're cutting out the application process because this is done through the tax code. It's done, through the IRS rather than through a bank or a credit union. You also potentially have, there needs to be robust oversight and accountability, but you have the potential for less fraud and abuse because you're sort of not relying on third parties and self-certification in some cases. Again, I'm not suggesting that it's the perfect program that is flawless, but we think it's a strong program.
And Representative Dunn, your session starts second week of Monday next in January. I'm wondering if you're thinking about potential legislation, maybe even if not potential legislation, in some discussions about the Paycheck Protection Program, other COVID-19 relief program. I know some of your colleagues, for example, wanted to be in session right now to serve as a check, for example, to the executive. I mean, the governor's ability to disburse funds, to enact certain orders. But, you're going to be in session in January. What are you thinking of doing in terms of oversight, transparency, and I guess generally speaking, help for our businesses, help for, Arizonans, but also, help that comes with transparency and oversight?
Right. Yes, we start January 11th, and we're already having conversations as our caucus and even across the aisle, what we can do. As far as this federal program, state, we don't really have oversight over the exact PPP because it's a federal program. We do have Joint Legislative Budget Committee has oversight over the money that came into the federal government that the governor has had to dole out and to send that money out. So there has been, all through the summer, there has been oversight with how the different COVID money has been spent. We're going to continue to work on tax policy, maybe something we can mirror what the federal government is, because when you can have exact dollars that a small business is spending every week or every quarter when they have to write those federal payroll checks, that taxes, that's real money that's saved that they can actually invest in their employees. And so those kind of programs that we can do on a state level that can actually provide relief immediately to businesses is something that we want to work on as a caucus. And we don't have any big legislation set for that, but that's part of our tax policy that we'll be working on in ways and means to try to get, to help as we can.
I want to go to our audience questions. There's been a couple of them. First question is that I think, Danielle, I think you already answered this one, but if you could just repeat your answer. Is there a requirement for recipients of the Paycheck Protection Program loans to retain the data?
Actually, the loan paperwork does require that the recipients have this data. So that's why it's even more frustrating that the government isn't collecting it. So, Yes. So, and frankly, even if the government hadn't required it through this program, employers have to have that information to file their taxes at the end of the year. So this is not new paperwork. I understand everyone's frustration with red tape and extra paperwork. That is not what's going on here. It's a case of all the employers have the information on whether they kept employees or not. It's just that the government is not asking for it so that it can be informing the data that Andrew was talking about. And actually, if I could just, as a shameless plug for POGO's website, we took all of that data that the Treasury has put into those zip files, because zip files, as Andrew said, are very difficult to work with. We actually found several billion additional streams of COVID relief spending, put it all into our data and added on top of that these overlays. And part of why we're doing that, again, the website is covidtracker.pogo.org, is not just so that people can find the specific examples of fraud. That is important, but more important is a context so that policymakers like Representative Dunn can look at his community and his constituents and say, but wait, there's significant unemployment in this zip code, but none of the funds are going there. So we can be learning from and helping policymakers better represent their constituents with that data. We'll be also adding to it data on COVID, hopefully in the next couple of months. So we'll be able to see where the actual examples of cases are happening on top of that data as well.
Andrew, I think this is a question for you. Is the ERTC available to businesses that already received or have received the Paycheck Protection Program?
So that's a great question, and it's not. And that's actually another initiative that we've been working with, and I think is an even lower bar than ERTC expansion. Even if Congress decides that they don't want to expand the employee retention tax credit, or they just want to extend it without really expanding the size of the program, one thing that we think that they should do, if they are going to extend it, is make sure that businesses that have taken a PPP loan can use the ERTC as long as they're not applying, the same wages to both the Paycheck Protection Program and the Employee Retention Tax Credit. So that's all that we want to ensure. And there's legislation out there in Congress, bipartisan legislation, that would ensure that there's not this so-called double dipping. But plenty of businesses that have exhausted their PPP loans now can't access the Employee Retention Tax Credit, and we think that given that small businesses are still struggling, that they should be able to access ERTC.
Here's a question from Sean. I'm sorry, Representative Dunn, go ahead, sir.
That's a very good point, because we've exhausted those PPP funds. Most people that applied for them in April, May, and June, that's all been done by August. So right now, if you're trying to add employees back to the businesses, our small businesses could really use this. So that would be a good push for people to try to get that across the finish line.
Here's another question from Shauna. Do they, and I guess she's meaning the people who have gotten the PPP loans, do they have to apply and submit data for forgiveness so they do not need to repay the amount received?
Yes.
Danielle or Andrew? All right.
Go ahead, Andrew.
Oh, sorry. No, yeah, that's my understanding of the program requirements. And one thing that I think is interesting that I was looking into the other day, the PPP, the application process, according to the Treasury Department, takes an average of 8 to 10 minutes, supposedly. And Representative Dunn, in your personal experience, it might have been longer than that. Certainly, you have to work with a bank or credit union, but the actual application from Treasury Department and SBA supposedly takes roughly 8 minutes. On average, the forgiveness process, on the other hand, Treasury said takes about 3 hours to fill out that paperwork. So, there's a balance to be struck here. Again, the forgiveness paperwork should be a little bit more burdensome, because, we're talking about, completely forgiving the money rather than just getting it in the door. But you do have to apply to have loan amounts forgiven.
You have to go
Except though, I'm sorry.
You go through your documents, you have to prove this, the employees and the taxes, and you have to prove it with your tax forms that you sent out. And there is a time limit on that as far as to apply to get your forgiveness. If you don't apply for it in time, then it converts to a payback loan. So, there is teeth in that matter. As far as for the people who are actually applying for forgiveness, you just have to do it.
Except if this legislation passed, which will just wave a wand for wholesale forgiveness, and then those are the requirements that will go away.
So we're talking about,
worried about.
Right. We're talking about current requirements, right? This is what you need to do in order to get forgiveness, unless, of course, Congress passes another legislation that does wholesale forgiveness.
That's right.
Here's another question. I think, Representative Dunn, I think you already answered this, but if you can kind of repeat your question. This is a question from Carrie. Since this is a federal program, what can the state of Arizona do at this point to ensure accountability or to ensure that accountability has taken place?
Good question. And it is a federal program. So specifically for PPP, the state does not have oversight, but we do have oversight for the CARES Act money that came into the state and that was going out to the rural Arizona and to the to Pima County and Maricopa County. So Joint Legislative Budget Committee has been working on that. And there, like you said, we have legislators that are still trying to push some of that dollars out. There's some negotiation with the governor as far as where that money should still continue to go. And they're still continuing to use some of that CARES Act money for specific projects. So there is some oversight on the CARES Act side, but not on the PPP.
Here's a question from Mary. And I think, Danielle, I think you alluded to this earlier on when you mentioned that, in fact, 90% of the people, 90% of the SBA loans actually went to small businesses. But the question from Mary is there any hard data so far to crystallize the belief that dollars are going primarily to top earners and not workers?
No, I think that's one of the things we definitely need to be able to figure out. And we don't have the answer to that yet. It's really anecdotal. And most of the anecdotal information is coming from criminal prosecutions of actual fraud, where people were falsifying tax and employment documents in order to qualify and receive these loans. And it turned out, as I mentioned, some people in Washington bought a row house. In Miami, there was a Lamborghini. Our team found, Chinese-owned private equity firms that qualified for them. So there's this whole range of problems, but they're really at this point anecdotal.
And I guess this is, I think we have time for just one more question. And any one of you can answer this one, but the question is, what are some of the best practices you've seen from other state legislatures across the country in complementing the Paycheck Protection Program on targeting state funds to those who did not receive adequate loans or no loans at all? I guess this is, it pertains to people who may not have received the loan for one reason or another. And the question then is that what have state legislatures done or best practices that they have adopted to deal with this issue? Andrew or Danielle?
I have to admit, I'm limited in my knowledge to the federal government, so I have to turn to Representative Dunn on that kind of question.
We're hearing a lot of things that not necessarily for PPP, but that they were doing some additional state dollars, state unemployment for people that were not getting back on the payroll, and so that's kind of contrary to what we were talking about as an employer. If you have too many government assistance, then employees weren't wanting to come back to work. And so that's kind of a double-edged sword that you're dealing with when you're giving need to people that are unemployed, but then they're encouraging them not to go back to work when employers are trying to use their pay protection program. So, but I think as a state, we're going to continue just to look at just individual issues like that we can help with, make sure we bridge the gap, and just kind of get our businesses open, good tax policy, so we can keep our schools open and get people back to work.
And I think we are out of time. Again, I want to thank Andrew, Danielle, and Representative Dunn for joining the Morning Scoop today. I really appreciate your time. To all our viewers and our listeners, thank you for spending 1 hour with us. I want to thank again the Project on Government Oversight for sponsoring this Morning Scoop. And with that, I guess I should say enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll see you around.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.